Welcome to the first of 3 F122 deep dive videos. My name is James Brallant, Social and Creator Manager on F122, and over the next 3 videos, we're going to be getting an insight on some of the changes that are making their way to F122, releasing on July 1st for Xbox, PlayStation, and PC. This first deep dive video is all about physics and handling changes. Now, this year has seen a lot of changes in the sport, whether it's new tracks, new regulations, or most importantly, new cars. So what better way of understanding how those changes have been reflected in-game by speaking to senior game designer David Greco. So David, thanks for joining us, and it would be great if you could just start by giving us an overview of some of the changes that have been made to the 2022 cars.
The major changes we made start first of all from the physics engine and the physics model. We had to look at what the real cars were doing and the differences that they made this new era of the cars, and we saw that they would be running much lower to the ground, for example. So we knew we had to improve and change our suspension model. Also, we had to improve on our collision model. Then we had to look at the aerodynamics because the way they work in real life compared to previous years is totally different. Now, most of the downforce comes from the ground effect, so from underneath the car, and we had to be able to recreate that. This is mainly the biggest changes we made to the physics model and then to the handling model.
Yeah, so it sounds like those are the key areas that you focused on this year. So can you talk a little bit about some of the physics changes specifically that have been made in F122?
Yeah, so specifically the first thing we focused on was suspension. The suspension, we needed to make sure that the suspension position was read perfectly, because we needed to make sure that the car could ride as low as possible to the ground. So it is an improved model to what we had previously, which also allowed us to improve the bump stops. Now it works much more like it should work in real life, and players will notice, for example, when going lower to the ground, you will reach the bump stops much earlier, so it will make the curb riding stiffer and a little bit more difficult than previous years, whereas before we didn't have really this. And so this was one of major changes we had to do in the physics model for us to allow to achieve what is happening in real 22 cars. After that, we moved into aerodynamics, so that we now knew we could run the car as low as possible. We could then model the new aerodynamics to use a lot more from the underbody and the body of the car, aerodynamic wise. And after we did that, we could model the wings. We managed to model the wings in a way that is much more realistic. Every team is playing a lot with the rear wing to try to find the optimal efficiency, because it's much more difficult to find for the rear wing than what it is for the front wing. Therefore, this has been replicated in the game as well. After this, we did the tire model. The first thing we did was to improve the physics model. We added tire drag, induced tire drag, which basically a tire under some level of slip angle, it is actually creating some drag because it's creating some extra friction with the ground. And now we replicate that in the game as well. Therefore, it will help even more those players that are very precise and smooth with their inputs on the steering wheel, because now will be more important to be able to not scrub as much speed as before, because the drag will slow you down a lot more from the tires.
Great. So when it comes to the ride height and downforce, how much do they play a factor with the cars this year with those changes?
Well, they play a factor because now, since we are able to be much more precise as to where the car sits related to the ground, we were able to lower the contact, the collision of the car, and now it's basically one-to-one with the 3D model. And this means that now it's really possible to bottom out both on normal driving and on curb riding, for example, which was something that wasn't possible before. And because of this, now the players will notice, for example, that the quality of the track, so of the asphalt, so if it is bumpy or smooth, makes a difference. The amount of downforce you have makes a huge difference. So, for example, if a player is trying a setup that is very low on wings, they will notice that they might start to bottom out at very high speed, say 330 kilometers an hour, something like this. Whereas if they go and crank up those wings and have a lot more downforce, they might start to bottom out at 300 kilometers an hour, and that will really make a difference on the setup choices the players have to make, not only anymore wing level, but also ride height and stiffness of the suspension as well.
So are there any scenarios that can happen during a race in F122 that didn't happen last year?
Yeah, for example, there are scenarios where you could get pitched onto a curb. For example, if you add a spin, for example, and you end up stopping on a sausage curb, it's it's rare that happens because there are not many sausage curbs around the track. But if it does happen and that sausage curb is big enough, which doesn't allow the rear wheels, the driving wheels, to have contact with the ground anymore, you'll get beached. So in that case, then the player will need to, I think online you can even disable the reset option. So those players that want to make super realistic on online, they could just end their race there because there is no way to get out of there. So yeah, it's very much more realistic on that sense. Something that they never happened in any F1 game before.
So this year's cars have significantly different tyres than in 2021. So what changes have been made when it comes to tyres to accommodate for that?
Yeah, the changes we had to make is, I think we spoke before about the induced drag, but then there is the handling data which comes after the physics changes we make, and the handling data had to reflect also those physics changes we made, and it's the last fine detail which basically tells the physics model to how it should then behave for what the players then will feel and play. So what we had to change was to replicate what we have been seeing in real F1 22 cars, which is the sidewall is smaller, which means the carcass will be stiffer, as well also as the way Pirelli made the stiffer carcass as well. This means that the handling data should say that the carcass is stiffer compared to 21, which this directly means that the tire pressure will be even different way and curb riding will be different as well. Basically, it's stiffer, so it should be a little bit more not difficult, different from 21. You should feel like a bigger jolt also through the force feedback, for example. Then another thing we had to see, because of the sidewall being smaller, the slip angle, for example, will be sharper. So the grip you get will be earlier and sharper, will come faster at the player, but it will also drop much faster. So they will end up feeling like the cars are, for example, really more understeering, but it's also due to the fact that not only the cars are heavier compared to previous years, but it's also because it's much easier to go into that understeer after the peak because the grip comes much earlier now, and also it drops much faster, which means that once you go understeer or you lock up, for example, or you oversteer, the amount of grip will be considerably less compared to 21. Whereas I think at the beginning we'll feel like there is more grip because it comes earlier and faster and sharper, but once you lose it, it's much sharper as well. So, and the balance in the end, it should feel reactive in a certain way because the tires are sharper, but because then the whole way the physics, the aerodynamics kicks in later, the car is heavier, the inertia is bigger. In the end, in the complex, it will be actually feel slower and more sluggish than 21 and previous years.
So as physics have such a massive impact on the handling, let's kind of move on to that now. So how different do the cars feel to drive versus those in F1 2021?
They can feel more understeering, but initially they feel sharper. But that's just before the whole weight transfer kicks in and everything. So the first input feels like, oh wow, this car doesn't have any understeer. But then once you start to push the car a lot or try to brake later, you'll feel like, especially on slow corners, that there is a lot more understeer, as we have seen in real cars, real F1 cars. It should also feel like there is more traction compared to 21, but it's also easier to lose that traction because as the tires are sharper, it means that also the drop-off is much sharper and more pronounced. So while you have that first kick of very good grip, you also have then a lot more loss of grip. Therefore, it's I think it feels like a different game, a different physics compared to last year and previous years because they are different cars, and I think we made the most amount of changes to the physics model and handling model that we have ever done before in one single year. So it really feels like a different car to drive.
So how do you think this will impact racing specifically?
I think it should be very interesting because I think you can approach, for example, setup in different ways in 22 compared to 21 and previous years. I have seen, for example, I've been pretty much fast and good with different amount of downforce, really, on various tracks. And so, some players that prefer to have more downforce, a bit like we have seen Ferrari, for example, and some players that like less downforce but more efficiency and therefore faster on the straight line, like we have seen Red Bull. And that's giving us really, really interesting races in real life, and I think it should give us also in the game, online, very interesting races. And also the tires have been also modeled a little bit different for the tire wear, and I have seen some strategy work out good even with 3 stops, for example, something that last year was not possible.
So have there been any changes to force feedback in F1 22?
There have been improvements on the way the wheel gets those forces from the suspension. So getting curbs or bumps will feel better than in 21. Basically, that is a direct result of having an improved suspension model. So we reflect that into the force feedback as well.
Can you talk a bit about custom setups and how they've changed in F1 22?
So custom setups mainly changed the wings. We before had a system where we had 4 different car upgrades that we would bring to different tracks. So, for example, Monza would have a very low drag upgrade, Monaco would have a very high downforce upgrade. Whereas now we decided to go more in line with what other simulators do, which is don't bring upgrades, but just give the whole variety of wings to the players. So now players can select up to 50 different settings of wings, and those settings of wings, they are all the same across the tracks. So, for example, if a player wants to try and run with very low wings in Monaco, they will find that it's not very effective because they lack a lot of downforce. The setup will play an important role because the difference you can make of downforce, but especially on drag, it's really in the fine detail now with the wings. And the wings now have different efficiency, front and rear. So it will changing the wing setting at the same time. Like, for example, if I go +4 at the front, doesn't mean I have to go +4 at the rear. Maybe I need to go +2 or +1 or whatever, because it changes the efficiency. This means changes the drag you have. This also means that it's different. The aerodynamic balance doesn't stay anymore because the rear wing is more than the front wing. So the more rear wing you put at the same time as you put in the more front wing, but you're actually shifting that balance to the rear. This is a big change in the way we do setups in 22 compared to previous years. And the other change comes from the suspensions. Suspension that now are modeled better on the collision, and the suspension position is much more precise now. It means that players will need to carefully choose the right height and their stiffness of the suspension of the springs.
So how much will custom setups play a factor this year when taking driver skill into consideration?
It will be very important to have a setup perfected for the driving style of each player. And I think it will be more important than previous years to find a right balance for the race as well, not only for qualifying. Because, for example, you will go quite a lot slower in race compared to qualifying, which means you could maybe have different stiffness or different ride height than you have in qualifying. Something that I haven't really seen in previous years.
And will custom setups from last year's game translate well to F1 22?
Not really for what I've been seeing. I think last year they tend to use a lot of rake, for example, and they tend to use pretty low ride height and very soft front suspension. That was possible due to the fact that the suspension position wasn't as precise as it is now. Basically meant that it didn't really matter how low you would go and how soft you would go. You would more or less always stay at the same distance from the bump stop. So it didn't really make that much of a difference in riding curves. Also, it didn't make that much of a difference in bottoming out, or made any difference at all bottoming out, for example, in previous years. Whereas now it does make a difference. So I don't think the things they could exploit last year would work in this year. I think that to conclude that 21 setups shouldn't translate very well to 22. Shouldn't be horrible to drive, but it shouldn't translate very well.
So when it comes to accuracy on all of these elements of the game, what insight do you get from Formula One and some of the teams?
Teams, real F1 teams, they do work with us through feedback. When, for example, they are able to test our game, they give us some feedback. But they can also give us feedback on some ideas or some things that we want to do, and they can tell us if, for example, that is the right approach to go or is the wrong approach to go. For example, there's been always people always saying that our traction out of slow corners especially looked always more difficult than real life. So we approached teams with an idea and how we thought we could improve this aspect of the game. And they were kind enough to tell us that yes, that is the right approach, so that should help a lot. And this is something that we will implement. We already implement a little bit for release, but we will further improve with patches. And it was thanks to the teams to tell us that it's on the right path.
Finally, in your expert opinion, what recommendations or tips would you give to players driving F122 for the very first time?
The first thing I see every time there is a new game is players on the wheel, they start either change or put their 21 settings into their force feedback before even trying the game as it comes default. I want to say that the default settings are not there just put out of nowhere. They are actually being tested by me specifically on most of the wheels. I'd say the first tip is to learn the game as it comes out default. Don't make any changes. And the second one is for everyone, pad players included. Don't change the setup right away before you learn the car and you learn the new tracks. So first learn the game, learn the physics. So learn the force feedback, then learn the car, and then start to do your changes and try to find more speed with custom settings, where is wheel or setup.
That's some good advice. Well, thank you very much for your time today, David. I know that there are loads of people out there that are really looking forward to getting their hands on this game. So
yeah, I'm looking forward myself to play online with other people, because I think I have about 700 hours on track only, plus all the hours, doing the data and whatever it is. But it's always been against AI. I'd like to have interaction with players.
Get out there and beat some players.
Or get beaten, but see how my work handling actually feels against other people, not only against AI.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We have 2 more deep dive videos on the way in the coming weeks, so make sure you're subscribed to not miss those. F122 arrives on July 1st for Xbox, PlayStation and PC. And if you pre-order the Champions Edition, you'll get 3 days early access and some exclusive additional content. See you on the track.